My daughter is a paper pusher who never heard a shot fired in anger. Franklin Vane said that to a room of 4 people on a Tuesday morning in April. He said it loud enough that the receptionist down the hall looked up from her keyboard. He said it while tapping his heavy gold USMC ring against the conference table like a gavel. The Mediator's office smelled like new carpet and old coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed at that particular frequency you only hear when a room goes very, very quiet. I didn't flinch. I didn't look at him. I pressed my tongue against the inside of my left jawline, against the 2 titanium surgical plates that have lived there for 6 years, and I waited. My name is Georgia Vane. I'm 40 years old. I'm a major in the United States Marine Corps, Judge Advocate General's Corps. 15 years of service across 3 duty stations. And the JAG case file sitting 6 inches from my father's tapping ring contained my closing argument from a capital murder defense, an argument I delivered through a jaw wired shut with surgical steel because a mortar round had blown a door hinge into my face 30 meters outside the wire in Bagram, Afghanistan. My father knows I'm a Marine. He's known for 15 years. He just decided a long time ago that it doesn't count. Franklin Vane served 30 years as a Marine infantryman, retired Master Sergeant. He earned that rank. I won't take it from him, but somewhere along those 30 years he built a wall in his mind. On one side, real Marines, the ones who carry rifles, who sleep in fighting holes, who come home with dirt under their fingernails and shrapnel in their legs. On the other side, everyone else, mechanics, logistics officers, cooks, lawyers, especially lawyers. When I told him I'd been accepted to law school on a Marine Corps scholarship, he was sitting at the kitchen table in the house I grew up in, Virginia Beach. He had his boots off, feet up on the chair across from him. He was cleaning his nails with a pocket knife. He didn't look up. "So you're going to be a secretary in a uniform?" My mother was standing at the counter. She stopped slicing a tomato. She didn't say anything. Nobody ever said anything when Franklin spoke. You just let the words land and waited for him to move on to the next subject. That was 2009. I was 24. I'd already completed officer candidate school. I'd already earned my commission. And in 4 years, I would be standing in a courtroom at Camp Pendleton, defending a 23-year-old Marine sergeant facing the death penalty for a murder he didn't commit. But my father had already decided what I was. A paper pusher. I need to tell you about the jaw. Because without it, you won't understand what happened in that mediation room. And you won't understand the man sitting across the table from my father. In 2018, I was deployed to Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. JAG officers don't typically go outside the wire, but I had a witness, a local contractor, who couldn't come onto the base for security reasons. So I went to him, standard practice for complex cases, a vehicle, a translator, a security detail. We were 30 meters outside the perimeter. The interview was wrapping up. I was closing my notebook when the first round hit. Mortar. The blast caught the vehicle broadside. The passenger door buckled inward and the hinge, a 6-inch piece of stamped steel, separated from the frame and hit me in the face. I don't remember the impact. I remember the taste. Copper and Afghan dust. I remember trying to speak and realizing my jaw wasn't where it was supposed to be, fractured in 2 places. The left side shattered along the ramus. The right side cracked at the angle. They wired it shut at Bagram's surgical unit. 45 minutes of work under fluorescent lights that buzzed exactly like the ones in that mediation room 6 years later. 2 titanium plates, 6 screws. 8 weeks of recovery time recommended. I took 11 days. Because 11 days after they wired my jaw shut, a 23-year-old Marine sergeant named James Corwin was scheduled to stand trial for the murder of a civilian defense contractor at Camp Pendleton. Corwin was my client. I was his defense counsel, and I was the only person who had uncovered what actually happened. The contractor, a man named Dennis Whitfield, had been running an extortion ring targeting enlisted personnel, young Marines, kids making $1,800 a month who owed money they couldn't pay. Whitfield had been skimming thousands from inflated service contracts and using the debts as leverage to keep his victims quiet. When Corwin confronted him, Whitfield was found dead 2 days later. The prosecution built their case on proximity and motive. They wanted the death penalty. I found the financial records. I found the pattern. I found 3 other Marines who'd been extorted and were too scared to come forward until I promised them, through a jaw I could barely open, that I would protect them. My closing argument is in military law textbooks now. I delivered it through wired teeth. Every word came out slightly wrong, slightly thick, slightly distorted, but every word was precise. Corwin walked free. If you've ever had someone in your family look straight through your sacrifice and call it nothing, if you've ever watched someone rewrite your life while you sat there in silence, stay with me. You're going to want to hear how this ends. I never told my father any of this, not because it was classified. JAG proceedings at that level are a matter of record. I didn't tell him because I already knew what he'd say. He'd find a way to make it smaller. He'd tap that ring and say something about how real Marines don't win wars in courtrooms. And I was tired of watching my own life shrink every time it passed through his hands. If I'm being honest, and I owe you honesty if I'm telling you this, I let the distance grow. After Thomas died, after the jaw, after the years of moving between duty stations and working cases that ate every hour I had, I stopped calling. Not out of cruelty, out of exhaustion. Explaining my pain to a man who didn't believe my work was real felt like bleeding into a bucket with no bottom. So I stopped pouring. My sister Claire tried to keep us connected. She'd text me photos of our mother's garden. She'd call on birthdays. But Claire lived under Franklin's roof in a way I never could. She'd learned early that agreement was survival. She nodded when he spoke. She laughed at his jokes. She signed whatever he put in front of her. That last part matters. Remember it. My mother died in January. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless. She was diagnosed in October and gone by the second week of the new year. I made it home for the last 4 days. I sat beside her bed in the house in Virginia Beach and held her hand while the hospice nurse checked the morphine drip. My mother's hand was thin, paper-light. She squeezed my fingers once and said, "You turned out strong, Georgia, stronger than any of them." Franklin was downstairs watching television. He didn't come up. I flew back to Quantico after the funeral. That night, alone in my apartment, I pulled Thomas's challenge coin from the drawer where I keep it. Officer Candidate School. Brass worn smooth on the edges from years in my hand. He'd scratched something into the rim himself with a knife tip. Semper Fi, Counselor. His handwriting was terrible. The letters are crooked and too deep on one side. Thomas was an infantry captain, Franklin's kind of Marine, the kind who carries a rifle and sleeps in dirt. Thomas died during a training accident at 29 Palms. He was 31. He would have hated what Franklin did next. 2 months after the funeral, I received a letter from a law office in Norfolk. Franklin was demanding mediation over my mother's estate, specifically the beach property in Sandbridge, a small cottage my mother had owned since before she married him. Assessed value, $187,000. My mother's will was clear. The property went to me and Claire, split evenly. I'd seen the will. Claire had seen the will. My mother's attorney had filed it. But attached to the mediation demand was a codicil, dated 11 days before my mother's death. It redirected the entire property to Franklin Vane. My mother could barely lift a cup of water 11 days before she died. She could not have signed a legal document. She could not have understood one. The signature on the codicil was shaky, thin, and wrong. I've read 10,000 legal documents in my career. I know what a forged signature looks like. The witness signature on the codicil belonged to my sister Claire. I sat in my car in the Quantico parking lot for 14 minutes after I read that letter. I know because I looked at the clock when I opened it, and I looked again when I finally put the key in the ignition. The engine was off. The windows were up. April in Virginia, and the car was getting warm. I pressed my tongue against the plates in my jaw, and I let it ache. 14 minutes. Then I drove home, opened my laptop, and prepared for mediation. Franklin hadn't just demanded the property. He'd built a case. In the weeks after the funeral, he'd been busy. He told the local VFW chapter, where he'd held court every Friday night for 20 years, that I had been removed from a case for misconduct, that I'd been passed over for promotion because of incompetence, that my mother had been ashamed of the path I'd chosen. None of this was true. He went further. When I was deployed or stationed elsewhere, he'd gone through the family home, my mother's house. He removed my commissioning photo from the hallway. He boxed up my meritorious service commendation. He took down every photograph of me in uniform and replaced them with his own, his infantry medals in a shadow box, his promotion certificates, his unit photos from Camp Lejeune and Okinawa and Kuwait. He left exactly one photo of me, my high school graduation, before I became something he couldn't control. Claire watched him do it. She told me later she tried to object once. He tapped his ring on the mantelpiece and said, "Your sister made her choices. This house remembers mine." Claire signed the codicil because Franklin told her to, because saying no to Franklin felt like standing in front of a freight train, because she convinced herself I didn't need the beach house anyway. She was wrong about that. It wasn't about the money. It was the last place my mother touched. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday in April. A small office in Norfolk. Court-appointed mediator. Standard procedure for estate disputes under $250,000. I drove down from Quantico the night before. I wore my service uniform, not to make a point, because I am a Marine, and I was walking into a room where my service would be questioned, and I would not dress like an apology. Franklin arrived first. I know because his truck, a black F250, with a Purple Heart plate and a USMC retired decal across the back window, was parked diagonally across two spots when I pulled in. He always parked like that, like the world owed him the extra space. Claire was already inside. She wouldn't look at me in the lobby. She studied her fingernails like they held the answers to questions nobody had asked. The conference room was small, one long table, 4 chairs, a water pitcher nobody touched. The fluorescent lights hummed, and then the mediator walked in. He was tall, mid-40s, neat suit, no tie. He carried a leather briefcase that looked heavier than it should have been. He introduced himself to the room. "Good morning. My name is James Corwin. I've been appointed to mediate this estate dispute." He shook Franklin's hand first, then Claire's. Then he turned to me. He extended his hand. I took it, and I watched his eyes move to my jaw, to the left side, to the half-second delay when I gave him a polite, professional smile. His grip tightened, just slightly, just enough. He didn't say a word. He sat down, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a legal pad. But I saw his hand pause over the pad for 2 full seconds before he wrote anything. He knew exactly who I was. What happens next is the reason I'm telling you this story. Franklin settled into his chair like he was taking a throne. He spread his hands on the table. The gold ring caught the fluorescent light. He looked at Corwin the way he looks at every man, measuring, categorizing, deciding whether this person ranked above or below him. "Before we start," Franklin said, "I want to make sure the record reflects who we're dealing with here." He pointed at me without turning his head. "My daughter is a paper pusher, JAG Corps. She processes the paperwork so the real Marines can do their jobs. She has never heard a shot fired in anger. She has never served in a capacity that required courage. And her mother, God rest her, was ashamed of the path she chose. He tapped the ring once, hard. The sound filled the room. That codicil reflects my wife's true wishes, not the fantasy version my daughter would like to believe. Claire was staring at the table. Her hands were in her lap. She was shaking. I pressed my tongue against the plates. I felt the titanium against the scar tissue. I let the ache spread through my jaw for 3 full seconds. Then I folded my hands on the table and said nothing. Corwin's pen had stopped moving. Franklin wasn't finished. He never was. That was the thing about my father. Silence wasn't permission to stop. Silence was an empty room he needed to fill with himself. I served 30 years. He leaned forward. The chair creaked. 30 years in the infantry. I carried a rifle in places this girl couldn't point to on a map. I buried friends. I bled for this country. And what did she do? He turned to Corwin now, man to man, veteran to veteran, the way he always recruited allies. She sat behind a desk and typed. He tapped the ring again, twice. My wife saw it. My wife understood. That's why she changed the will. She wanted the property to go to someone who earned what this family stands for. Corwin was watching him, not writing, just watching. "Mr. Vane," Corwin said. His voice was level, professional. "I've noted your statement. I'd like to hear from your daughter now." Franklin waved his hand. The gesture I'd seen 10,000 times. Clearing smoke, dismissing a waitress, brushing away a life. "She'll tell you she processes paperwork. That's all she's ever done." Corwin turned to me. "Major Vane, would you like to respond to your father's characterization of your service?" I looked at Corwin. His face was calm. His pen rested on the pad. But his eyes, steady, brown, patient, held something behind them. Something coiled. "I processed the paperwork," I said. 5 words. Delivered flat. I watched them land. Franklin snorted. Satisfied. He sat back like a man who'd just won a hand of poker. He actually smiled at Claire. A triumphant little nod. "See?" Claire's hands were trembling in her lap. She still hadn't looked at me. "Now," Franklin said, pulling the codicil across the table toward Corwin, "this document reflects my wife's final wishes. Signed, witnessed, notarized. The Sandbridge property, $187,000 assessed value, transfers to me as the surviving spouse. My daughter has no legitimate claim." Corwin picked up the codicil. He studied it. He turned it over. He set it down in front of him. "And the witness?" he asked. "My younger daughter, Claire." Franklin nodded toward her. "She was present when her mother signed." "Ms. Miller." Corwin's voice was gentle. "Can you confirm you witnessed your mother sign this document?" Claire opened her mouth, closed it. Her fingers twisted a tissue under the table. I could hear the paper tearing. "Yes," she said, almost a whisper. "And the date on this codicil is January 3rd, Corwin said, 11 days before your mother's death." "That's correct," Franklin said. Loud, final. The ring tapped once. Corwin set the codicil flat on the table. He placed both hands beside it. Then he looked at me. "Major Vane, I have a procedural question for you, if you'll permit." I nodded. "In your professional experience, in your work processing paperwork," and here his voice did something almost imperceptible, a slight weight on those last 2 words. "Have you reviewed documents where the signatory was in the final stages of terminal illness?" Franklin shifted in his chair. "I have," I said. "And in your professional assessment, does the signature on this codicil appear consistent with a signatory who, 11 days from death due to pancreatic cancer, would have had the physical and cognitive capacity to execute a legal instrument? Franklin's ring stopped, mid-tap, suspended an inch above the wood. "No," I said. "It does not." "Objection," Franklin said. The word came out fast. Wrong context. This wasn't a courtroom, but he'd heard it on television enough to reach for it. "She's not a handwriting expert. She's a paper pusher. She doesn't have the authority." "Mr. Vane." Corwin didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This is a mediation, not a trial. There are no objections. And Major Vane's professional assessment of legal documents falls squarely within her area of expertise." Franklin's jaw tightened. I watched the tendons in his neck surface. "I want to continue," he said. Quieter now. "I want the codicil entered into the record." Corwin looked at him for a long time. 5 seconds. 6. The fluorescent lights hummed. The new carpet smell pressed against the walls. The water pitcher sat untouched between them, condensation running a slow line down the glass. "Mr. Vane," Corwin said, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Is there anything you'd like to amend in your characterization of your daughter's military service before I proceed?" Franklin leaned forward. The ring met the table. "She is a paper pusher," each word punctuated by a tap. "She sat behind a desk while real Marines bled. She has never." 30 meters outside the wire, Bagram. Corwin said it to me. Not to Franklin, not to Claire, to me. His eyes were fixed on mine, and his voice had changed. Not louder, not harder, but stripped of the mediator's professional distance. This was a different man speaking, a man remembering. The room stopped. I pressed my tongue against the plates. I felt the titanium. I felt the screws. I felt the 6 years of scar tissue that had grown around the metal that held my face together. 30 meters, I said. Corwin nodded, once, slow. Then he reached down to his briefcase. Not the legal pad side, the other side, the side that had made the case heavier than it should have been. He pulled out a manila folder, thick, sealed with red tape along the spine, Department of the Navy insignia on the cover tab. I recognized the format. I'd filed hundreds of them. Official JAG service record, full and unredacted. He held it in both hands for a moment. Then he set it on the table directly on top of the forged codicil. The sound it made, heavy paper meeting hard wood, was the loudest thing in that room. "Mr. Vane." Corwin's voice was quiet, controlled. The voice of a man who had spent years in mediation rooms, but had never, until this moment, needed to say what he was about to say. 6 years ago, I was a 23-year-old Marine sergeant sitting in a courtroom at Camp Pendleton. The charge was murder. The prosecution wanted the death penalty. I had no money. I had no connections. I had a court-appointed JAG defense counsel. He paused. He looked at me, then back at Franklin. "Your daughter." Franklin's mouth opened. Nothing came out. 3 weeks before my trial, your daughter was 30 meters outside the wire in Bagram, Afghanistan, conducting a witness interview for a complex case. A mortar round struck her vehicle. A door hinge separated from the frame and fractured her jaw in 2 places. They wired it shut with surgical steel. She was given 8 weeks of recovery time. Corwin's voice didn't waver, but his hand, the one resting on the sealed folder, pressed down harder. The knuckles whitened. "She took 11 days. Then she flew to Camp Pendleton and stood in a courtroom and delivered a closing argument through wired teeth. Every word came out wrong, thick, distorted. She couldn't open her jaw more than a centimeter. And it didn't matter, because every word was precise. Every word was right." He leaned forward. "She proved I was innocent. She uncovered an extortion ring that 3 separate investigations had missed. She protected 3 young Marines who were too scared to speak. And she did it while eating pureed soup through a straw at 3 a.m. because she couldn't sleep and she couldn't stop working, and her husband had just been killed in a training accident at 29 Palms. Claire made a sound, small, something between a gasp and the beginning of a word she couldn't finish. Franklin hadn't moved. The ring was frozen on the table surface. His face had gone the color of old concrete. That closing argument, Corwin said, is in military law textbooks. I looked it up after. The case that saved my life is studied by every JAG student who passes through Charlottesville. Your daughter wrote it with a broken face and a broken heart, and she never told anyone because she doesn't perform her service for an audience. Corwin stood. He placed both hands flat on the table and leaned toward Franklin. You packed her commendations into boxes. You removed her photos from the walls. You told your VFW chapter she'd been removed from a case for misconduct. You told this room she never heard a shot fired. His voice dropped. Master Sergeant Vane, your daughter took mortar fire in a combat zone and went back to work in 11 days to save a man's life, and you put your medals where hers used to hang. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The condensation on the pitcher reached the tablecloth. Claire was crying without sound, her shoulders moving in small, rhythmic jerks. Franklin opened his mouth. I didn't... Corwin's hand landed on the sealed folder. Before this session, I formally requested Major Vane's complete JAG service record through proper channels. It is now part of this mediation file, and based on my review of the codicil presented today, a document signed by a terminally ill woman 11 days before her death, witnessed under apparent duress and contradicted by the original filed will, I am halting this mediation and referring the codicil to the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office for criminal fraud investigation. He looked down at the thick manila folder covering the forged document beneath it. Your daughter's service record is now sitting on top of your forgery, Mr. Vane. I'd say that's about right. Franklin's chair scraped backward, 6 inches. The sound cut through the room like a blade. His hands were flat on the table, but the fingers had curled. The gold ring reflected nothing now, just the dull overhead light pressing down on all of us. Georgia. His voice cracked on the second syllable. Georgia, I looked at him. The man who cleaned his nails with a pocket knife when I told him about law school. The man who parked across 2 spaces. The man who replaced my photos with his medals and told the VFW I was a disgrace. I pressed my tongue against the plates one more time. I let the ache come. I let it stay. You had 30 years to ask me one question about my career, I said. You never asked, not once. So you built a version of me that was small enough to fit inside your disappointment. And then you believed it. I paused. That's not my failure, Dad. That's yours. The room held still. Franklin's mouth worked, but produced nothing. His hand reached toward the gold ring on his other hand, the reflex to tap, to punctuate, to assert, and stopped. His fingers just closed around it, holding on. Claire's chair shifted. She was looking at me now, first time all morning. Her eyes were red and wet and full of something I hadn't seen in them since we were children. Corwin hadn't sat back down. He stood with one hand still on the sealed service record, the other holding his pen at his side. He was watching Franklin the way I imagined he'd once watched a jury foreman, waiting for the verdict to land, and it was landing. I could see it in my father's face. Not all at once, not like a wall collapsing, more like watching a tide go out and realizing the ground underneath had been hollow the whole time. The mediator's office cleared in 11 minutes. I know because the clock on the wall behind Corwin's chair read 10:47 when he formally suspended proceedings, and 10:58 when I walked out the front door into April sunlight that felt like it belonged to a different day, than the one I'd walked into. Franklin left first. He didn't speak. He stood, collected the truck keys he'd laid on the table like territory markers, and walked out without reaching for the codicil. It was still under the service record. He left it there the way you leave something you don't want to touch anymore. Claire followed him to the parking lot. I watched through the window. She stood next to his truck for 30 seconds. He got in, pulled the door shut, and backed out without rolling down the window. She stood there holding her purse with both hands while the black F250 swung wide across the lot and disappeared onto Granby Street. I didn't follow either of them. Corwin was still in the conference room. He was resealing the service record with fresh tape. His hands were steady but slower than they'd been when the session started. I stood in the doorway. "You requested that file before today," I said. "The moment I saw your name on the intake sheet." He pressed the tape flat. "I wasn't sure until you walked in. Then you smiled." The asymmetry. The half-second delay on the left side. The souvenir from 30 meters outside the wire. "That jaw saved my life," he said. "Or the woman attached to it did. I wasn't going to sit in a room and let someone call her a paper pusher." I didn't trust my voice for a moment. I pressed my tongue against the plates. Then I said, "Thank you, James." He nodded, set the sealed folder into his briefcase, clicked it shut. "Your father's codicil is going to the Norfolk County DA's office by end of business today," he said. "I've flagged it as a priority referral. Forgery of a testamentary instrument in Virginia is a Class 4 felony. The assessed property value of $187,000 puts it well above the threshold for grand larceny by fraud, which is an additional Class 3 felony charge." He said it the way lawyers say things, precise, no emotion, just the architecture of what was coming. "The witness signature will be investigated separately," he added, "but based on what I observed today, the visible distress, the hesitation, the physical trembling, I'll be noting in my referral that the witness appeared to have signed under coercion or undue influence. Claire. He was protecting Claire without being asked. "I'll send you a copy of the full referral filing within 72 hours, he said, "for your records." I didn't learn what happened next all at once. It came in pieces, the way consequences do when you're not in the room where they land. A phone call here, a forwarded email there, the slow machinery of a life coming apart at the seams while the person living it can't understand why the seams won't hold. The Norfolk County DA accepted Corwin's referral 9 days after the mediation. A detective from the Economic Crimes Unit visited Franklin at the Virginia Beach House on a Wednesday afternoon. I know this because Claire texted me that night. One line, "They came to the house today." He didn't say a word for 3 hours after. The grand jury indictment came 6 weeks later. 2 counts. Forgery of a testamentary instrument, Class 4 felony. Carrying 2 to 10 years and up to $100,000 in fines. Grand larceny by fraud for the $187,000 property value. Class 3 felony carrying 5 to 20 years. Franklin's attorney negotiated. They always negotiate. But the charges were on the public record, searchable, permanent. The VFW chapter found out before the trial date was even set. A retired master gunnery sergeant named Bill Cooper, a man who'd sat next to Franklin at that same Friday night table for 9 years, called me in June. I'd never spoken to him before. He introduced himself and then said 5 words that told me everything. "We read your JAG file." Corwin's referral had included a copy of my service record as an exhibit, public filing, and someone at the courthouse had mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to Cooper, who walked into the VFW the following Friday and set a printed copy on the bar. "He told us you'd been removed for misconduct," Cooper said. His voice was thick, embarrassed. "He told us that for 2 years, Georgia. every Friday night. Some of us repeated it. I repeated it. I'm calling to say I'm sorry, and I'm calling to say he won't be coming back. Franklin's stool at the bar went empty. Then it went to someone else. His name came off the summer cookout roster. The post commander stopped returning his calls. The hardware store on Shore Drive, where he'd run a tab for 15 years on handshake credit, sent him a letter requiring payment in full. $2,340. I learned about the hardware store from Claire. She called in August. Not a text this time, a real call. Her voice was small and careful, like someone testing whether a bridge will hold weight. He doesn't leave the house much anymore, she said. The truck sits in the driveway for days. He watches television with the sound off. I didn't respond right away. I listened to her breathe. Georgia, I signed that paper. I know what I did. I told myself you didn't need it, the house, the money, any of it, and I knew that was a lie while I was telling it. I was scared of him. I've been scared of him my whole life. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. She was crying, quietly, the way she'd cried in the mediation room, shoulders moving, no sound, like she'd learned a long time ago that crying loud in Franklin's house got you nothing but a lecture about weakness. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said. I'm asking if you'd ever pick up the phone if I called. Not for Thanksgiving, not for Christmas, just sometime. I sat with it. The weight of what she'd done and the weight of why she'd done it. A sister who grew up in the same house I did, under the same man, with the same fear, except she'd stayed and I'd left. I'd found the Marines. She'd found the path of least resistance. Both of us had been shaped by Franklin Vane, and both of us had the scars to prove it. Sometime, I said. That was all. She said, okay. I said goodnight. I hung up and put the phone on the counter and stood in my kitchen at Quantico for a long time, looking at nothing. The indictment moved forward. Franklin's attorney entered a plea of not guilty, which surprised no one and helped no one. The original will, the real one filed by my mother's attorney, was reinstated by the probate court in September. The Sandbridge property was split evenly between Claire and me, as my mother had intended. $93,500 each. I didn't sell my half. I haven't decided what to do with it yet, but I drove down there one Saturday in October. I sat on the porch. The wind came off the Atlantic carrying salt and the last warmth of the season. My mother had planted hydrangeas along the south side of the cottage. They were still there, a little wild, a little overgrown. Nobody had trimmed them since January. I trimmed them myself. Then I locked the door and drove home. Franklin's trial was scheduled for November. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. The system I'd spent 15 years serving would handle it from here. The same system he dismissed as paperwork. That evening, the evening after I trimmed my mother's hydrangeas, I didn't drive back to Quantico. I drove west. 6 hours. Through Virginia, across the Blue Ridge, through country that flattened and dried and opened up until the sky was everywhere. I drove through the night and into the next morning and then through another afternoon until the road turned to desert and the air went thin and warm and the light took on that particular gold that only exists in Southern California an hour before dark. I pulled up to the gates of Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center 29 Palms. I didn't go in. I wasn't there for the base. I was there for what the base held. The memory of a man who'd loved me when I was 26 and newly commissioned. A man who called me counselor like it was the most important word he knew. A man who carried a rifle and slept in dirt and never once, not once, told me my service was less than his. I parked on the shoulder across from the main gate. The desert stretched flat in every direction. The sky was turning that deep amber that comes right before the color drains out of everything. I pulled Thomas's challenge coin from my pocket. Brass, worn smooth from years of my thumb running across the edge. I turned it over. The scratched letters on the rim. Semper Fi, counselor. His terrible handwriting. The letters too deep on one side, too shallow on the other. Made with a pocket knife and more love than precision. I set it on the dashboard. The light moved across it as the sun dropped. The brass caught the amber, then the orange, then the deep red, that lasted about 4 minutes before the desert went dark. I sat there until I couldn't see the coin anymore, until the only light was the guard shack down the road and the stars coming through clear and cold above the flats. I pressed my tongue against the plates in my jaw. For the first time in 6 years, they didn't ache. The titanium was warm. The scar tissue was quiet. My jaw just felt like my jaw. I smiled. The left side lifted a half-second late, the way it always will. And that was fine. Some people wait their whole lives for the ones who dismiss them to finally understand what they missed. I stopped waiting a long time ago. The people who see you clearly don't need to be convinced. And the ones who never will, well, that's not a failure you carry. That's a door you're allowed to close. If this story stayed with you tonight, if you've ever done something hard and real and necessary and watched someone who should have been proud decide it wasn't enough, I'd like to hear about it. What was the moment you stopped explaining yourself to someone who'd already made up their mind? Leave that in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button now. There are more stories like this one, and I think they'll matter to you the way this one mattered to me.